Imagine you're on a late-night flight, the cabin quiet, passengers drifting to sleep, when suddenly armed terrorists storm the aisle, guns raised, voices screaming. Panic explodes, fear takes over, and hundreds of lives hang by a thread. The captain is seconds away from breaking until his eyes lock on one woman. She isn't crying. She isn't panicking. She's calm. And in that calm lies the power to change everything. The night began like any other, with the plane cutting smoothly through the clouds under the calm glow of the moonlight. Passengers settled into their seats, some already drifting to sleep, others quietly reading books or whispering in low voices. Flight attendants moved down the aisles with practiced smiles, serving drinks and assuring everyone was comfortable. It was the kind of flight where nothing felt unusual, where safety and routine wrapped around the passengers like a blanket. The hum of the engines was steady, almost comforting, and for many on board, it felt like just another ordinary trip through the skies. But ordinary moments can shatter in an instant. Without warning, the quiet air inside the cabin was pierced by a sudden commotion. A loud, harsh command cut through the silence, followed by the metallic sound of weapons being revealed. Four armed men stormed forward with terrifying confidence, pushing past rows of shocked passengers. Gasps and screams filled the space as the reality sank in. Terrorists had taken control of the plane. The once peaceful atmosphere twisted instantly into one of fear, panic, and chaos. People froze in disbelief, some covering their mouths to stifle cries, others clutching loved ones as if holding tighter would protect them from what was happening. Children began to cry, their innocent voices adding to the chaos, while parents desperately tried to shield them from the sight of masked men with guns. The terrorists barked orders with aggression, their voices echoing in the narrow cabin. Every movement seemed magnified, every second stretched into something unbearable. The air itself grew heavy, thick with terror, as passengers realized they were trapped thousands of feet in the air with no way to escape. The cockpit became the terrorists' target, their boots pounding against the floor as they forced their way toward the captain. Each step they took sent a chill through the cabin, reminding everyone on board that the situation was deadly serious. The passengers who had moments earlier been sipping coffee or staring out at the clouds now sat paralyzed in fear, watching their worst nightmare unfold before their eyes. In a matter of seconds, the entire flight had shifted from serenity to survival, and the fate of every person on board now hung in a fragile balance. The cockpit door slammed open, and everything inside the aircraft seemed to freeze. The captain, who had been calmly monitoring his instruments, suddenly found himself staring into the dark, cold barrel of a gun. The terrorist in front wasted no time, his voice was sharp, commanding, filled with venom as he shouted, "Change the course now, or everyone on this plane dies." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The co-pilot stiffened, his hands instinctively hovering above the controls, unsure whether to obey or resist. In that moment, the heartbeat of the entire crew seemed to echo louder than the engines roaring outside. The captain's mind raced. Training had prepared him for emergencies, storms, technical failures, even medical crises, but never for this, a direct confrontation with armed men who clearly had nothing to lose. Sweat slid down the side of his temple as he gripped the controls tighter. He knew that one wrong move could push the terrorists into pulling the trigger, yet complying with their demands could mean leading his passengers straight into unimaginable danger. It was a brutal dilemma: obey and risk disaster, or resist and risk immediate death. Behind him, muffled sobs and gasps could still be heard from the passengers. The weight of their fear pressed heavily on the captain's shoulders. He wasn't just flying an aircraft anymore, he was holding the lives of hundreds in his hands. Every eye in that cabin, whether seen or unseen, was depending on him to make the impossible choice. The terrorists loomed closer, one of them slamming the butt of his gun against the panel to prove they were serious. The sharp metallic clang rang in the captain's ears, a reminder that time was running out. For a brief second, he glanced at his co-pilot, their eyes locking in silent communication. There was no room for spoken words, only the unspoken question: what do we do now? The captain's hands trembled, but his mind refused to surrender to panic. He forced himself to steady his breathing, knowing that fear was exactly what the hijackers wanted. If he broke, everyone would break. If he faltered, the plane and everyone inside it would be lost. In that tense moment, with the gun still pointed at his head and the threat of death hanging in the balance, the captain realized this was no longer just a test of skill, it was a test of courage. Panic spread through the cabin like wildfire. The moment the terrorists announced their control, the atmosphere inside the plane shattered. Passengers who had been calm and relaxed seconds ago were now gripped by sheer terror. Screams broke out, sharp and uncontrolled, echoing off the narrow walls of the aircraft. Some people cried loudly, others clutched at the seats in front of them, shaking as though the ground beneath them had disappeared. Mothers held their children tightly, desperately trying to shield them from the horrifying sight of masked men with weapons. The innocent voices of children, crying in confusion and fear, added to the dreadful chaos. Everywhere the eye turned, fear was written on faces. Some passengers pressed themselves against the windows, as if looking out at the clouds could somehow offer a way to escape. Others closed their eyes, whispering hurried prayers, hoping for a miracle. The uncertainty of what the hijackers planned to do was unbearable. Would they crash the plane? Would they execute passengers one by one? No one knew, and that unknown became more terrifying than anything else. The terrorists shouted for silence, their harsh voices cutting through the cries, but the fear was too overwhelming. Every command made the passengers flinch, every step of the hijackers' boots sent a chill through the air. The sound of a gun cocking silenced the cabin for a few moments, but the trembling never stopped. Hands shook uncontrollably, breaths came in ragged gasps, and the collective heartbeat of hundreds of people thudded loudly in the silence. Some passengers tried to hide their faces, ducking low in their seats as if making themselves smaller would protect them. A few brave souls glanced around, trying to make sense of the situation, but even they quickly looked down, afraid of drawing attention. The cabin had transformed from a place of comfort into a prison in the sky, where every second felt like borrowed time. The weight of fear was suffocating, pressing down on everyone equally. Strangers clung to one another, united not by choice but by desperation. It was a scene of complete helplessness, hundreds of lives suspended in the air, trapped between hope and despair, their fate controlled by the ruthless men standing in the aisles with guns. Amidst the chaos, when the cabin had become a storm of panic and fear, there was one figure who seemed untouched by the hysteria. A woman sat quietly in her seat, her hands resting gently in her lap, her breathing steady and controlled. While others screamed, wept, or shook uncontrollably, her eyes remained calm, her posture upright, her expression strangely composed. She did not look away from the danger, but neither did she allow fear to dominate her. In a sea of panic, she was like an anchor, unmoved and unbroken. The passengers around her began to notice. Children nearby, crying in terror, gradually quieted as she placed a gentle hand on one of their shoulders, whispering words too soft to be heard but strong enough to soothe. She looked into their eyes with reassurance, as though silently saying, "You are safe with me." The parents, who had been nearly paralyzed with dread, felt a strange comfort watching her. Her serenity seemed contagious, a quiet reminder that not all hope was lost. The terrorists, shouting and pacing down the aisle, tried to instill fear in everyone, but she refused to give them that power. Her calm gaze never challenged them directly, but it also never submitted. It was the kind of quiet defiance that didn't provoke, yet somehow resisted. Each of her movements, measured, deliberate, unhurried, was the opposite of panic. She adjusted the blanket around a frightened child, gave a nod of reassurance to the woman beside her, and gestured with her hands for people to stay still, to stay strong. Her presence began to change the atmosphere, little by little. People who had been trembling uncontrollably started to control their breathing. Those who were sobbing tried to quiet down, taking courage from the way she held herself. Even the captain, glancing back from the cockpit, noticed her. In that moment, he realized she was not just calm for herself, she was calm for everyone. Her courage, silent yet powerful, was spreading through the cabin like a hidden flame, pushing back against the cold fear that had consumed them all. In the middle of a nightmare, she became a symbol of resilience. Without raising her voice, without lifting a weapon, she showed everyone that fear didn't have to control them. And sometimes, one person's steady heart is enough to keep hundreds of others from falling apart. The captain's hands were still trembling on the controls, his mind caught between impossible choices. The voices of the terrorists rang in his ears, their threats slicing through the silence like knives. He could feel the weight of every single life pressing down on his shoulders. In that suffocating moment, when fear threatened to paralyze him completely, his eyes drifted back toward the cabin, and there she was. The woman sat like a rock in the middle of a storm, her face steady, her breathing even. She wasn't pretending to be strong, she was strong. The captain noticed the way she calmed the children around her, the way her gentle hand gestures asked the passengers to remain still, to trust. Her presence radiated something he hadn't felt since the hijacking began: control. She had no weapon, no authority, no special training that he could see, but her composure spoke louder than any words. It was as if she silently told him, "Do not give up. You are not alone." For the first time since the nightmare began, the captain felt his chest loosen, just slightly. He took a deep breath, trying to mirror the steadiness he saw in her. If she could find courage in the face of death, why couldn't he? He had years of training, he had the skills, and most importantly, he had the responsibility. But until that moment, he had almost let fear strip him of all that. Her calm became his anchor. Each time the terrorists shouted, each time panic rose among the passengers, his gaze returned to her. And each time, he felt steadier. The shaking in his hands lessened. His thoughts became clearer. He realized that leadership wasn't just about orders and control panels, it was about spirit. And she, without a word, had reminded him of that. Slowly, a plan began to take shape in his mind. He could use the plane itself as a weapon, not against the passengers, but against the hijackers. A sharp maneuver, if timed correctly, could throw them off balance. But for that, he needed courage, he needed focus, and he found both in the quiet strength of the woman who refused to break. In that critical moment, her silent bravery became the spark that reignited his will to fight. The captain knew he couldn't let her down. He couldn't let any of them down. And for the first time since the hijacking began, he believed there was still a chance. The captain tightened his grip on the controls, his mind sharpened by the plan forming inside him. Every second felt like a lifetime, but he knew the moment to act had come. With a sudden, calculated movement, he pulled the aircraft into a sharp maneuver. The massive plane lurched violently to one side, sending drinks, bags, and loose objects flying through the cabin. The terrorists, caught off guard, stumbled hard, their weapons wavering as they lost balance. For a split second, silence held the air, then chaos erupted again, but this time it was different. Passengers who had been paralyzed by fear just moments before suddenly felt a surge of courage. The woman's calm composure and the captain's daring move had lit a fire in their hearts. The cabin was no longer filled with helpless cries, it was filled with determination. One man leapt from his seat, grabbing the nearest terrorist's arm and shoving it upward as the gun fired harmlessly into the ceiling. Others joined in, emboldened by the sudden chance. A group of passengers wrestled another hijacker to the floor, kicking away his weapon as he fought desperately to regain control. Screams turned into shouts of resistance. The tide had shifted. And at the very center of it all, the calm woman rose. Her steady presence now transformed into fearless action. She rushed forward, pulling children out of harm's way and urging the men to keep pushing. Her voice, clear and strong, rang out above the chaos, "Don't stop it together, we can do this." The fear that once held the cabin hostage had turned into unity, and unity had turned into strength. The struggle was fierce, the terrorists fighting with every ounce of brutality they had, but they were outnumbered, overpowered by people who had found their courage. Within moments that felt like an eternity, the attackers were pinned to the ground, restrained by belts and anything the passengers could find to bind them. The once hopeless cabin was now filled with gasps of relief and cries of triumph. The captain, still steady at the controls, looked back briefly and saw the unbelievable sight: his passengers, ordinary men and women, had become heroes. And at the heart of it all stood the woman whose calm had sparked it. What once felt impossible had become reality. The terrorists no longer controlled the plane. The people did. When the last terrorist was tied down and his weapon stripped away, the cabin finally exhaled. For the first time since the nightmare had begun, there was silence, not the silence of fear, but the silence of relief. Passengers slumped into their seats, some crying softly, others embracing strangers as though they were lifelong friends. Children clung to their parents, trembling but safe. The air still carried the echoes of chaos, but underneath it all was something stronger: survival. The captain steadied the plane, his hands now firm on the controls. His chest rose and fell with deep breaths, his eyes burning with exhaustion yet shining with determination. He had done it not alone, but together with the very people he had sworn to protect. As the plane descended toward safety, he thought back to the moment when everything had seemed lost, when the weight of fear had almost crushed him. And then he remembered her. The woman who had stayed calm when everyone else broke. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't fought with fists or weapons at first, but her quiet strength had rippled through the entire cabin. She had been the spark, the unseen leader who turned despair into courage. Without her, panic might have consumed them all. Without her, he might never have found the will to resist. When the wheels finally touched the runway and the plane rolled to a halt, cheers erupted, mixed with tears of overwhelming gratitude. The passengers clapped, hugged, and whispered prayers of thanks. Rescue teams stormed aboard, securing the terrorists, but the eyes of those on board were not on the hijackers anymore, they were on the woman who had stood calm in the storm. The captain unbuckled his harness and stepped into the cabin, his voice thick with emotion as he addressed the shaken but victorious passengers. He looked directly at her and said, "In the darkest moment, when I nearly lost all hope, I saw you. Your courage reminded me that fear doesn't win unless we let it. You gave me the strength to fight back, and in doing so, you saved us all." The cabin fell quiet, everyone realizing the truth of his words. Sometimes heroes don't roar. Sometimes, they don't stand in the spotlight or carry weapons. Sometimes, the greatest hero is the one who stays calm when the world is falling apart and through that calm, gives everyone else the courage to rise.